Can you use technology to communicate with the dead? In this video, I want to talk about a body of evidence of such a phenomenon, and also a technique that I have discovered that absolutely is 100% real and lets you hear the voices of the dead. When I was like 12 or 13, we had the internet, and it was the early days of dial-up. And I remember being interested in all things paranormal. I still am. I find the concept of ghosts fascinating. Obviously, I have a strong sound and video technological interest. And so it was natural for me to come across a website that seemed to blend the two things. This is WorldITC.org. And this website, unbelievably, is still running. And at the time, I would use my modem, 56Ks of raw power, and navigate to this website. And I was fascinated by what I found there, which is people, a number of people, including a whole group of people in Luxembourg, who purported to communicate with the dead. They did this via various means, from simple tape recorders and microphones up to custom-built devices, a thing called the SPIRICOM, as well as the nascent world of computers, home computers, and receiving files and images on their computers which purported to show life after death. These files were apparently appeared overnight on, I assume, computers that weren't connected to the internet, but possibly were. This notion of capturing spirit voices is old. There is a whole field of this, and it's called EVP, Electronic Voice Phenomena. And that is the notion that if you take a tape recorder and you record in a very silent room, and you ask questions, and you listen very carefully, then you may hear voices that you didn't hear at the time in that final recording answering your questions. And this is exemplified by a man called Konstantin Raudiv, a Latvian researcher who wrote a book, Breakthrough, which I have here, where Konstantin talks about doing this exact thing. And to his great surprise, after months and months of trying, starts to hear voices. Voices that seem to reply, Tava mate, Latvian for your mother. Little phrases, little tiny polyglot phrases referred to elsewhere. Polyglot meaning that single sentences seem to contain a multiple of languages as well. And of this kind of weird mishmash, pitched up high, quite distinctive, but definitely there, according to the researchers. Here's an example EVP. This is from Tom and Lisa Butler. Here's the recording. What does it say? Again. What did it say? In a second example, an entity offered an opinion that there's a synergy, there's a synergy, there's a synergy. This was recorded with a Panasonic digital recorder with ambient background noise. On this same page, we see some examples of images captured by placing a camcorder really close to a detuned TV. So you're getting all kinds of intense wild patterns and pictures. And in single frames, purported images are shown. Sorry, I need to stop laughing. Including a person holding a dog. There's the dog. Here is an example of a Raudiv captured voice.
A request by the experimenter that the voice entities should tell him from where they came. Delicious lunch.
Did you get that? The key thing I think there is you have to be told what to listen for. Listen to this. What did you hear? We declare that we are all responsible. Did you hear it then? Of course, this is the speaking piano. This is this absolutely incredible experiment where they make a machine play a piano and sort of transpose the frequency bands of human speech onto the available bands of keys. I think a really, really important takeaway here is how intelligible it is when you can see the subtitles and you know what you're listening for. Now, here's how I feel about all of this stuff. I find this fascinating for lots of different reasons. The number one reason is I love ghost stories. I love reading ghost stories. The ghost stories of M.R. James, for example. If you join my Patreon, I have a couple of recordings where I read entire M.R. James stories into the microphone for you. You can go and listen to those. I love a ghost story. I love ghost films. I love Poltergeist, Poltergeist 2, The Shining, one of my favorite films of all time. And all ghost films deal with this kind of awe, this sense that anything's possible, that you don't know, and you don't know that lurking in the dark is something that is going to come glooming out at you, a face of someone you know, or some unnameable cosmic dread. And that same thing can be applied to sound as well. If you listen to static for long enough, what if you heard a voice? What if a voice came creeping forth from that and started speaking to you? What a thrill, a frisson of terror and excitement that sensation would be. Have you ever had that thing where you're alone in your studio at night and for whatever reason in a recording, there is a sound that sounds like someone talking off to one side behind you and you go, holy shit. And you have this immediate jump because it actually sounds like there's a person in the room with you. What a feeling. And of course, this is to mention nothing of the ultimate in human endeavors, that is trying to make sense of what happens after we die. We all owe a death. And how can such thought and such creativity, how can all of this that's in our heads disappear? How can consciousness come to be in the first place and let alone dissipate? And therefore, in my opinion, why I think people will look very hard at static to try and find voices. But I am very skeptical about the actual results that are seen here. And there are lots of things that are really quite brazen on this site, such as, for example, the images, which are, let's be real, look a lot like extremely ghetto cut and paste Microsoft Paint jobs of people apparently from the spirit realm. Interestingly, and somewhat problematically, the images of these people from the spirit realm seem to bear an overwhelming similarity to precise images that were taken of them during their life. So weird, isn't that? It's not a different angle, a thing that would be very easy to do now with AI, but at the time, it kind of looks exactly like the photographs that we have of these people in life, but in death. And here is Dr. Mueller, seen here in life and seen here in spirit. It looks similar. It looks similar right down to the shadows. Although the glasses seem to have been removed, you can actually sort of see the glasses have kind of been painted out white. Yeah, okay. There's another really problematic one. There's a guy called Friedrich Jürgensen who was purportedly pointing his camera at the TV and getting these images which sort of materialize. Here's an example of one of them, which is from Mark Macy's website. Mark Macy's the guy behind WorldITC. This was the image. Does she look familiar to you, the woman, in any way, shape or form? A woman smiling at something? There's an excellent, excellent video here from Alexandra de Carvalho Borges. Unfortunately, this image, which is by Friedrich Jürgensen, purportedly of the spirit realm, yeah, it's a still frame of Linda Hamilton, the star of Terminator, in a film King Kong Lives, from a TV movie from 1986. The Friedrich Jürgensen thing is literally a still from a film. This doesn't bode well, you see. There is, for example...
Morning, this is George Meek. This is Konstantin Raudiv.
That is a brief recording of Konstantin Raudiv telephoning George Meek from beyond the grave. There's a lot of evidence here which, if true, is evidence of the afterlife, and if not true, I think is at best evidence of people who really wanted to believe in something, were perhaps frustrated with their attempts to do so and push things. That's just a still from a film. That's not evidence of the spirit realm. And I also think with the case of the EVP thing, the guy behind WorldITC himself says that it takes maybe 3 months to be able to hear the voices and pick them out correctly. To me, that sounds a bit like it takes you time to attune and hear what you want to hear in the noise, and maybe enough time to start capturing certain types of it. I would strongly suggest that you spend a bit of time and look through the WorldIT site at some of the sort of somewhat bonkers things that you can find on here. Voice characteristics before and after death of the physical body by George Meek. You know, the guy who invented the SPIRICOM. Now, I'm very interested in the SPIRICOM. It was basically a device that was used to contact the dead and to have them speak. And interestingly, when you listen to the description of the SPIRICOM, it sounds a lot like a vocoder. So here's this sort of diagram, a signal block diagram of the SPIRICOM Mark IV. We start with acoustic generators, which we can see are waves at these frequencies, okay, then going into an FM transmitter and then being received and then played into a speaker and then recorded on a microphone to a cassette recorder. So in short, it's like sort of taking the components of a vocoder, the sort of all the tones, the bass tones, and then beaming and receiving them over a short distance and then playing the results out. Something that is eminently buildable. And here is George Meek and his colleague Bill O'Neill at the SPIRICOM device. Here's some examples of the SPIRICOM.
I don't understand. Oh, the preamp.
And
Third transistor. I don't understand. Oh, the preamp.
I mean, these sound awesome. And I'm listening to that going, let's put my Mala Melodies hat on. Is that a vocoder or a talk box? It sounds more like a vocoder because there's a dropped constant tone when the voice isn't sort of intermodulating it, as it were. There's quite a few recordings on here, link there, that you can help yourselves to and listen to. Fascinating MP3s, which you can mull over.
Hello, I am George Meek, Director of Research for Metascience Foundation.
You can listen to basically George Meek reading out the entirety of his book. Excuse me while I download this, because if it hadn't occurred to you, this website is an absolute sampling goldmine. And in fact, those of a modular persuasion may remember that I made a video about the radio music many years ago, and I used sounds from worlditc.org in that video. Spirit recordings are absolute goldmine. Spirit recordings are an absolute goldmine for this sort of thing. So if nothing else, I recommend that you go through worlditc.org as sampling material. Yeah, it's very hard to have any conclusive thoughts about research that was apparently done, you know, in 1979 from people who themselves have now passed to the spirit realm. I wasn't there, and I can't verify whether it's possible that, you know, the people here had built a vocoder and maybe, just maybe, well-meaning, they wanted to try and create some evidence, or maybe someone was interfering with them somehow and transmitting something that they were receiving. It's, 1979, I must say, vocoders are not an easy thing to come by. In that era, we're talking Sennheiser vocoders. But maybe people were producing, there were a thing that you could get a schematic for. An interesting question to ponder. Maybe it was real. Maybe he really was communicating with the dead through a kind of a radio vocoder. Who am I to say? There's also something else, which is just, man, radios. They are absolutely delightful and terrifying. Have you ever experimented listening to shortwave radios? Those, again, of an old video perspective may remember I made a demo of a shortwave radio module called the RF Nomad. And I talk a lot about the kind of fire and brimstone of shortwave radio. You can hear spooky sounds on shortwave radios that you can't explain with tones, Morse code, or number stations. Wait for it. Woo! Love that, where it stops broadcasting and it disappears. So what did you just hear? That's me. I made this recording, and that is a recording of number station S6. Number stations, by the way, are spy broadcasts, broadcast all over Europe, but can only be decoded if you have a special decoding text. Unless you have the text to decipher it against, you can't decipher it. Proper weird stuff. You're like, wow. It's not ghosts, but it's an example of the kind of fruity fire and brimstone that you can hear from radios, from weird noises and horror sounds to garbled voices and mania. What I love about this is just the kookiness of it as well. How about this? This is a lot of effort goes into making the voices sound normal on Earth. So some of the efforts aren't successful. German researcher Fritz Malkoff established contact with the spirit group Cloverleaf, which included the late philosopher Count Hermann Kaiserling, whose voices sound unearthly during this telephone dialogue.
Ja, hier. Oh, das ist sehr schön. Ja, das ist sehr schön.
I mean, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I'm listening to that, obviously, with my Big Milo Melodies hat on. I'm going, it's not sped up. It's pitch shifted, isn't it? Is that a vocoder voice? How is that? Thoughts on a postcard. How is that done? Look at this wonderful, warm and loving group of people who I'm sure, wanted to do good. Here is the picture of Linda Hamilton on the Breakthroughs in Technical Spirit Communication booklet. And so what do we do with all this? What do we do with this funny website? Whether or not it's real isn't for me to say, frankly. But we can definitely get a little frisson, a little, what if it was real? What if we listened to static for long enough? Maybe, just maybe, we can hear the voices ourselves. You can try it and find out. That's the nature of technology, is it's such a sort of, these boxes, macabre, weird little sort of lament configurations. Who knows what's going on inside those weird circuits and what could interfere with them? You don't know. Until proven otherwise, the possibility is always there. Build your own SPIRICOM, folks, and see what you can get out. Now, I mentioned at the first part of this video that I mentioned a guaranteed way to capture the sounds of spirit recordings. And there is. And it also involves analog tape and things like this. You see, in the 1960s, my grandfather and grandmother were communicating with relatives in Canada. My grandmother was Canadian. My grandfather was an RAF pilot who was stationed over in Canada as a trainer, trained people to fly planes in the RAF. And my grandmother was Canadian. He married her and brought her over to the UK. And he would send tapes to Canada where they would record their voices and the Canadian relatives would receive these wonderful audio tapes so they could kind of hear them chatting, because long distance phone calls were, I guess, expensive at the time, and tape was this new phenomenon. My grandfather was quite techie, it seems, and so he had a tape recorder. Now, when my grandmother died, we were clearing out her house, and under the stairs was a little box, and inside it were a load of reel-to-reels. And I, being an audio-curious person, said, "Give me those immediately, and I will look through them and see what I can find." And on them, there were lots of things, including mainly a lot of bad classical music that my dad had taped off the radio to listen back to when he was a student. But there was a tape in there labelled 1964 Christmas. And when I put it into the tape recorder and I looped it and I clacked the thing and let it roll, I heard the spooky sound of voices, an ethereal choir in this large room. And it was the sound of a sort of choral performance. It was very sort of odd and distorted and strange. And it faded out. And all of a sudden, room tone faded in, the unmistakable sound of a live microphone in a medium-sized room. And I heard a voice. I heard a voice loud and clear. And I instantly knew the voice that I was hearing. That voice was the voice of my grandfather. Now, why this is significant is because my grandfather was dead. My grandfather had been dead since 1968. He died long before I was born. I never met him. I never heard his voice. But of course, I know my father. And so in that moment, I had a sense of generational recognition. I knew immediately whose voice it was. It was my grandpa's voice. I knew it. Except I'd never heard it in my life. What I have heard is my father's voice, and my own voice, a sort of modulated version of my father's. I instantly could hear the echoes of my father's, the construction of his voice that was built from the construction of my grandfather's voice. I knew there was no other person it could be. Instant recognition. So weird. And indeed, the voice of the dead. Why that recording is so significant is because it is one of only 2 recordings that I have of his voice. And in this incredible time capsule of a tape, I hear my grandfather interacting with my grandmother, who I knew for many decades, and my father and my uncle as young boys are in that tape too. And I hear them talking to each other and their family. And I hear my grandfather interacting and answering and talking and interjecting. So in just this simple little reel-to-reel analog recording, I get a sense of a living person that was a literal ghost from a tape. So now I can really actually understand a little bit about this man that I never knew. And it's not through video, it's just through sound. A long form sound recording has the power to give you a sense of the person on the other end, to know who they are, because our voices carry so much of our personality. I really have a sense of who he was, what it would have been like to have a chat with him. I can sort of almost imagine his responses to things I might say because I've listened to that tape lots of times. It's incredible. And what the point of this video is to say is that it's all very well to think about that notion of hearing the dead of people who have long since passed. But that tape, what it proves is if you take a tape recorder, you have one in your pocket right now, and you go to the voice notes app and you hit record. And in that recording, you speak to your loved ones as they are alive now. Get them to talk into that recording at length about anything. Their lives, perhaps, but just the business of the day. because I did that very thing with my grandmother, and I have actually since in very recent months done the same thing with my father for this exact reason. Because there's nothing stopping me making an audio recording now in life at length and then putting it somewhere safe in many different places digitally to help preserve against the fear of digital rot. And when, unfortunately, they inevitably go, you have a recording that you can play back and feel like they're in the room with you, or you can play to your children or your nephews and nieces or what have you. And the memory of that person can live on for other people. You literally can record ghosts. You can do it right now, but they won't become ghost recordings until it's too late to make similar recordings. So let this be a reminder. If you've been thinking about doing this at all, you have no excuse. You have all the technology you need right now. Voice recording on a phone, perfectly good enough. Hit record, put it on the table in front of them, and get them to speak about anything. Those recordings, they can reach across generations and let people perhaps who aren't even born hear the voices of those long dead. Happy Halloween.